Imagine a world where the creeping frost and the encroaching darkness aren't just an inconvenience that makes you put on an extra sweater. Imagine them as a lethal, inescapable force. In the pre-industrial medieval era, the biting cold of winter dictated literally every single aspect of human existence. Today, we're diving into this fascinating thermal ecology. We'll be looking at how ordinary people and elite nobles alike engineered their homes, their clothes, their diets, and even their sleep schedules just to survive.
So the fundamental question we have to grapple with is this: how do you survive a winter that actively wants to kill you? Before electric heating or gas furnaces, the cold was a relentless antagonist. It required our ancestors to master thermal physics. And sure, they didn't have the scientific vocabulary that we have today, but they absolutely understood the reality of thermodynamics through trial, error, and sheer civilizational resilience.
Section 1. The Architecture of Cold, Designing the Outer Shell.
The historical contradiction here is absolutely fascinating. You'd probably think the mighty stone castle was the ultimate winter refuge, right? Well, actually, it was a thermal death trap. Thick stone walls without insulation act as a massive cold sink. They literally drain the warmth right out of anyone standing near them. And those grand, high-vaulted ceilings, they just allowed all the convective heat to rise up and vanish into the drafts. On the flip side, consider the peasant longhouse. A low, heavily thatched ceiling that smelled of dried earth and wood smoke trapped a thick, life-saving blanket of warm air. And that packed earth floor actually absorbed the intense heat from a central open hearth, continuing to radiate a deeply comforting warmth long after the flames died down to embers. So ironically, the humble peasant dwelling was a highly efficient biological heating system.
But to be fair, castle builders weren't entirely helpless. They learned to manipulate physics too. Specifically, a concept called thermal lag. This is the delay between an object absorbing heat and releasing it. Medieval architects built massive, oversized fireplaces, like the incredible one surviving at Rochester Castle, to maximize this effect. They utilized stone memory. They'd keep those massive hearths roaring all day, so the stone walls would act as a thermal battery. Then, during those frigid pre-dawn hours when the fires naturally died down, those walls would radiate stored heat back into the rooms to keep the inhabitants from freezing.
And this really shows how every architectural detail had to serve multiple survival purposes. Think about castle windows. They had to be narrow on the outside to defend against arrows and biting winds, but they splayed wide on the inside. This funnel shape allowed precious daylight in while fundamentally reducing the velocity of the incoming freezing air. It was literally defensive military architecture doubling as critical thermal management.
Section 2. Harnessing biological heat, the living furnace.
2,000 watts. That is the metabolic heat output of a single lactating dairy cow. To put that into perspective, that is the exact equivalent of a modern electric space heater cranked all the way up to high.
And knowing that completely changes how we view the medieval house barn, where human beings and their livestock shared a single roof. The sheer genius of the era is captured perfectly in this historical observation. The arrangement was not squalid negligence, it was calculated biology. Heat is a byproduct of life, and if you design the structure correctly, that byproduct becomes the system. By keeping their most precious capital, their cows and sheep, on one side of a low wattle fence, peasant families harnessed constant convection currents. Even though the air was thick with the pungent smell of livestock, ammonia, and wood smoke, this biological furnace could keep parts of the living space at a really comfortable 65 degrees, all while a deadly blizzard raged at sub-zero temperatures just outside the walls. Moving on to Section 3, the armor of textiles, the personal barrier. The medieval layering system was all about creating barriers of still air. You'd start close to the skin with linen undergarments. Then you pile on heavy wool tunics, overgowns, and finally thick cloaks lined with squirrel, marten, or, if you were royalty, ermine. And this textile armor, it didn't come off when you went to sleep. In fact, wealthy nobles used canopy beds heavily draped in thick fabrics. A canopy bed wasn't just for showing off your wealth. It was essentially a heavily insulated textile tent pitched inside a freezing stone box to trap your body heat through the long, dark night. The contrast in how different classes strategized their survival is just stunning. For the peasantry, out working the fields, rough wool was a literal lifesaver. Wool is hygroscopic, meaning it can absorb up to 30% of its weight in freezing rain and water vapor while still retaining your body heat. Was the biting dampness of heavy, wet wool comfortable? No, absolutely not, but it kept you alive. The nobility, meanwhile, relied on localized insulation. Those magnificent medieval tapestries you see in museums today, a skilled weaver took an entire month to make just 1 square meter of that fabric. But when hung a few inches from a damp, freezing castle wall, they created a still air gap that reduced convective heat loss by a massive 40%. They were highly effective, mobile insulation.
Section 4. Fueling the internal furnace. Calories as combustibles.
Fueling the body required incredibly dense winter diets. For the peasantry, the daily baseline was pottage, a thick, slow-boiled root vegetable stew, and winter ale. Because raw water was dangerously polluted, peasants drank around 60 gallons of ale a year per person. The brewing process boiled the water to make it safe, while the grains provided massive, much-needed caloric energy. On the extreme other end of the social ladder, the nobility consumed things like sack posset and cottle ferry. These were rich, hot, highly caloric custards made of wine, cream, egg yolks, and expensive imported spices like ginger. They were actually treated as medieval medicine, explicitly prescribed to treat winter chills and fuel a shivering body from the inside out.
And finally, Section 5. The 2 sleeps, the rhythm of the hearth. Before the industrial era, humans practically everywhere engaged in polyphasic or biphasic sleep. It wasn't the continuous 8 hours we expect today. Instead, as the sun went down, they entered the first sleep for about 4 to 5 hours. Then, around midnight, they naturally woke up for an hour or two, a period known universally as the watch, before returning for a second sleep until dawn. We see this ancient biological rhythm documented everywhere, from Chaucer's Canterbury Tales to the midnight prayer routines of monks across Europe.
So, what did ordinary people actually do in the middle of the freezing night during the watch? Well, they prayed, they talked quietly with their families, but crucially, they tended the fire. A peasant's central hearth was treated almost like a living entity. Striking a new fire from the sharp crack of flint and tinder in the biting, damp cold of a pitch-black room was a monumental and sometimes terrifying task. So waking up to fuel the embers wasn't just a quaint cultural habit, it was an absolute biological necessity to survive the longest, deadliest nights of the year.
But today, this rhythm is entirely gone. The death of the 2 sleeps came entirely at the hands of the Industrial Revolution. As public gas lamps and eventually electric lighting conquered the darkness, human beings were able to stay up later and later. We eventually condensed our rest into a single continuous 8-hour block of monophasic sleep, fundamentally erasing a survival rhythm that had defined human civilization for thousands and thousands of years.
But here is where it gets truly fascinating. In the 1990s, a sleep scientist named Thomas Ware conducted an experiment where he subjected people to pre-industrial lighting conditions, giving them just 10 hours of light a day. Without modern artificial light, human biology reverted. Within weeks, the participants began naturally sleeping in 2 distinct phases again, waking up in the middle of the night for a period of quiet reflection. It proves that this rhythm isn't just history, it is written directly into our human physiology. And that leaves us with something pretty profound to think about. Through modern engineering, continuous power, and artificial light, we successfully conquered the lethal cold and the endless dark of the pre-industrial winter. But looking back at how intimately our ancestors were tied to their thermal environment, their livestock, and the very rhythms of the night, we have to ask, what deep ancient human connections to nature did we completely lose in the process? Thanks for exploring this with me, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.